Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malde, Senior Policy Analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Centre. In this week's episode, BBC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal and I chat with Alexander Kustov, an Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. We discuss Professor Kustov's research on how we might or might not be able to shift public opinion in the United States to increase support for immigration. One promising approach that will be the subject of Professor Kustov's forthcoming book, In Our Interest, How to Make Immigration Popular, is adopting demonstrably beneficial policies that make voters confident their government is managing immigration in their interest. This is fascinating and important research, so stay tuned. Immigration is an often emotional and politically charged topic, with loud voices on both sides of the debate. Yet immigration is vital for the United States' economy, international competitiveness, and national security. Understanding why people hold the views they do, and to what extent we may or may not be able to increase support for immigration, is key for those working to expand legal immigration in the United States. Today, Theresa and I are very fortunate to welcome Alexander Kustov, an assistant professor of political science at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, to talk about his fascinating research on these questions. Professor Kustov studies democratic governance and public opinion with a focus on managing immigration and ethnic tensions in high-income countries. He specializes in survey, computational, and experimental methods, drawing on diverse data sources from original polls to political texts and historical records. His work has been published in various academic journals and has featured in popular outlets such as the Washington Post, the Financial Times, and The Economist. Alexander has a forthcoming book called In Our Interest, How to Make Immigration Popular, which we will be touching on in this conversation. So, with that bio out of the way, welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks for having me here.
Great to have you. And I just want to start with question about your research. So can you tell us about your primary research interests?
Sure. So I'm an empirical political scientist who studies all things immigration. In the past, I've been mostly interested in more academic questions like how regular voters form and change their views on the issue, or how politicians then respond to those views when they formulate their campaigns or policies. But more recently, I've been trying to work with various partners from the government and other stakeholders on the more practical aspects, so persuasion and more effective governance. After a lot of this work that I'm doing is about figuring out how we can better realize the gains of more open immigration policies while minimizing the potential for public backlash to it, right? We're talking about democracies, right, where a lot of folks don't really like immigration that much, right?
Yeah. So what made you focus on these topics? First of all, why immigration and why this particular angle on it?
Good question. I mean, I think I've been doing this for so long that it's hard to remember how it all started. One thing that I do remember is that when I came to grad school in Princeton in 2013, so it's been more than 10 years at this point, I was supposed to focus on studying ethnic conflict with a regional focus on Africa. And, I've been long fascinated with this question of why people care so much about their various identities and why they may even decide to kill each other because of some seemingly superficial ethnic or religious label or not. So I've done some research on that, but what happened, I think it's a pretty common occurrence, is that my advisor, who was supposed to help me with all that, left to another university. So I just had to pivot and study something else. And I think I just realized that if you think about it, immigration and the contentious politics around it is basically the biggest ethnic conflict there is, right? Because essentially what you have is that people are pitted against each other almost solely based on their country of origin, right? And it certainly often becomes destructive and dysfunctional, if not violent, right? So I just thought that that's kind of a natural thing to study given all my other interests.
Yeah, so let's talk about your research on how we might or might not be able to shift public opinion to increase support for immigration. You had a paper out that shows that people don't change their views on immigration very much. Can you tell us more about this paper and what it means for persuasion efforts?
So this paper was published in the journal Politics that, we did with a few colleagues more than 5 years ago at this point. And it's basically something that motivated most of my subsequent research. And what we find there is basically that people's general views on immigration, whether they are for or against it, are very, very stable. They don't really change much in response to either information campaigns or kind of big economic or political changes like recessions or refugee crisis. What usually changes instead is how important immigration is to people, right? And whether they vote based on it, and what some folks call the political salience of immigration as an issue. So this surprised quite a lot of immigration researchers because we also have a lot of evidence that people's political view on immigration and other issues are not very strong or robust, right? There's a long-standing idea in kind of public opinion research that most people don't care much about politics. They don't know much about it. They have other things to do in their lives, right? So a lot of the kind of things that we pick up in public opinion polls are kind of random. They just depend on like what people saw recently in the news. And I think there's some truth to that, right? There's also the whole industry of like issue polling and academic survey experiments where you can see how like even a minor change in question wording can, change how people respond to those questions, right? So there was that, right? But at the same time, we also saw that paper spoke to a lot of people who did very sophisticated, high quality randomized control trials of information campaigns according to all the best practices in the industry, like, pre-registration, highly representative and large sample sizes and all that. And what they basically found is nothing, null effects of any of those information interventions. So we know that people are not very informed about immigration. And what those researchers find usually is that you tell people this information and they don't really do anything in response. There's nothing that's happening. So what we did in our paper that was different is that we looked at all publicly available so-called longitudinal data where the same people are interviewed over and over again over the years, and as opposed to just like a one-shot survey or whatnot, right? And what we see in this longitudinal data is that it's true that people might indeed slightly change their stated opinion on particular policy, let's say the border wall or whatnot, here and there in response to information or various events, but they also tend to go back to their initial position after a few years, which makes sense if you believe that immigration views are not just random. They are probably rooted in, people's stable personality traits, like, ethnocentrism, just kind of how racist people are in the end. And so that's why I should say a lot of people call this paper a Debbie Downer paper, right? Because effectively what it shows is that a lot of the persuasion efforts that we have might be futile. The more optimistic angle, though, is that, it's also true then that if you are an anti-immigration demagogue, the only thing you can hope for is not necessarily make people more anti-immigration, but just, basically increase the salience of the issue, that, more people are going to be talking about it, potentially more people are going to be voting based on it. So that's the only thing you can do, basically. I guess I also should acknowledge that, we say in the paper that longer term generational change is possible, right? So we don't necessarily want to argue that people never change their mind on the issue or anything else, right? It's also the case that we find that younger people, those below 25, basically those who haven't really had their full kind of political socialization yet, they are also more likely to change their views, right? So from a certain perspective, you can see how you can potentially target younger voters as those who potentially bringing change to the issue in one way or another.
This seems to have a lot of relevance to, what we see of information campaigns, messaging campaigns, policy communication. Tell us more about your approach here and how it's maybe been received. You talked a little bit about, sort of that folks see this as a Debbie Downer and maybe not, but there's a lot of efforts in the immigration space, I think, from a lot of different positions. I mean, I see political polling all the time. BPC has done some asking people's opinions about immigration or immigrants. There's the Gallup poll that's asked over time, do you want to see immigration increase, decrease, or stay the same? And for those of us who are engaged in the immigration debate, like every time I see one of these, first thing I look at is, what exactly was the question asked, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
we know that depending on how the question is asked, that can influence the outcomes. But you're looking sort of bigger picture, like, does it all really matter? And I guess that's a really big question. Where do you think this puts the immigration debate?
Yeah. So, given all this evidence of kind of stable views in the long term. For a long time, I kind of just gave up on this very effort of changing people's minds. So I was kind of, depressed for some time for sure. But then I had a colleague, Michelangelo Landgrave, who is a professor at the University of Colorado right now. And so he convinced me actually to give it another try. And so what we did there in a recent paper is that we told people in a survey experiment about how difficult the legal immigration process is in the US. A lot of people in the policy field, from my understanding, think that it's one single thing that people misunderstand about immigration, right? Not necessarily some kind of information about how many immigrants are there, like what they consume, how much they contribute, but like just in terms of how difficult the process is in general. And what we find is consistently is that it is something that really can change people's perspective, right? So first of all, it's something that people are very, very uninformed across partisan lines, right? So it's not the case that Democrats are much more informed about it than Republicans, for instance, right? So Democrats might support immigration for other reasons, right? But what we see just in terms of this basic knowledge about policy, very few people are informed. And it seems like all across the board, it's something that can potentially shift people's minds, at least when it comes to supporting more open legal pathways for immigration, right? I wouldn't necessarily say that this small intervention, just telling people in a short narrative about how, about the long wait times, about how long and expensive the process, even for the most uncontroversial case like spousal immigration, let's say, that very few people oppose, right, can change everything in the immigration debate, right? But it seems like one piece of information that can potentially nudge some people to be more open for sure. Another thing that I've been trying to do recently with the Russell Sage Foundation is to inform people about the national benefits of increasing immigration and the costs of not doing so. Not necessarily to change their mind, actually, but potentially just convince folks who are already on board with immigration to care more about it. And what was different about what I did there is that I used the explicit arguments in favor of increasing immigration, as opposed to just saying that immigration is good. So I did some kind of, just content analysis with some of my students here at UNC Charlotte. We just like look at, a random sample of hundreds of different kind of newspaper articles from like mainstream outlets about how people talk about immigration in a pro-immigration way. And what we find, and I'm actually very curious to hear your perspective on that, is that very few of those articles explicitly talk about the need for increased immigration, right? A lot of them just say that, immigration is good. We need immigrants. We need to respect and support those who are already here. But they rarely like connect all the dots and say that given all this, thus we need to increase or streamline and simplify legal immigration process. Like it's very rare to see this argument for some reason. I don't know, maybe it's just something that's commonsensical, but again, given all this other research that I've done, it seems like people really don't connect the dots themselves, right? So I feel like it's important to kind of have this explicit argument. So what I do there is that I present people with a bunch of different narratives of that sort. And what I find is that in general, it does help to improve their attitudes a little bit, but most importantly, it convinces those folks who are already on board with immigration to care more about it, which I think is important. I can talk more about it as well.
I just want to intervene and say I haven't conducted as extensive research as you, but I will tell you that every time I go out and speak to audiences who aren't, engaged in the immigration debate on a regular basis, when I talk to them about how difficult it is to immigrate legally, I see big eyes. And what I liken it to is that every American, no matter where you're from, has contact with the tax system at least once a year, right? So most Americans understand something about the tax, even they have somebody else do their taxes, but they kind of have more information and understanding of the tax system than the immigration system because so few Americans relatively interact with the immigration system. And yet, there are lots of attorneys and judges and members of Congress who say the immigration system is more complicated than the tax system. So given that disparity, you can kind of understand why for many people that knowledge is just lacking.
Oh yeah, no, actually kind of related to that, I thought, I later in the today I might mention, this new policy of welcome core, right? When people have to basically have an opportunity to invite immigrants themselves, right? I feel like a lot of folks who did that now realize how difficult it is, right? Just in terms of the bureaucracy. So maybe we should have some kind of, I don't know, like policy program where people have an opportunity, not necessarily forced to, like, have an opportunity to invite an immigrant or like, just deal with the bureaucracy, and then people see just how crazy, insane this whole process is.
So, Alex, you drew a distinction between like changing people's minds and making the issue more salient. So when it comes to that research about what happens when you inform people about how restrictive the system is, did that actually have the potential to change people's minds and making them go from anti to pro immigration? Or was it more of the salience issue there as well?
Yeah, no, so it is research where we tell people about how difficult the system is. People actually improve their attitudes. We didn't have a very big sample size to look at the different subgroups like Republicans, Democrats, and so on, but it seems like something that's happening across the board. We're still kind of working on the kind of follow-up studies with bigger samples and whatnot, because it is very practically relevant whether it's something that can only convince, let's say, moderates. That was kind of our initial idea that's probably going to be more effective when it comes to independents and moderates. I don't think so, but I think it's still something that remains to be seen.
So, you started talking about this. Some of your research is how you can shift opinions by talking about demonstrably beneficial um, policies around immigration. Why as you said, why is it good for America if we have legal immigration? What were you trying to examine there, and what kinds of things did you find had the biggest impact?
Yeah, so this is something that I'm trying to do in my upcoming book, right? And this is yet another way how I'm trying to grapple with the evidence of stable immigration views that don't really change much. And the basic idea here is we can either change people's minds by providing them with some information or kind of some narrative or some kind of communication device, and then they potentially can respond to that and change their view on the issue. But a different way to look at it, and that's what I'm trying to kind of put forward in my book, is that to change the underlying policy themselves, basically, so that people can see for themselves that immigration is good for them, right? The basic idea there that a lot of the popular opposition to immigration that we see might be stable, relatively speaking, but it's not categorical. It's not solely like based in racism of some sort, right? So it's possible to imagine how the same people who currently oppose immigration can potentially change their mind if we had very different policies effectively, right? It's a very difficult question to kind of grapple with because obviously we don't have those policies. As you know, it's not something that's easy to implement oftentimes, right? So that's why it's a very kind of low, like kind of slow, long-term process that requires a lot of hard work, right? So persuasion is possible, I would argue, but it's something that happens across generations, basically. When we slowly implement better policies, assuming that's possible, of course, in the current political environment, and only then we can have better attitudes. And ideally, what we would have in the end is some kind of virtuous cycle where people support immigration because they trust their government on the issue, and then the government is implementing good policy that people support, and then kind of goes back and forth, and immigration politics is healthy. And I think there are some examples in the world that show us that it's possible, right? So Canada is, I think, one example where it's something that's potentially happening, right? And it's a question of how feasible it is for the United States to be like Canada right now, right? But I think in general, I think it is possible to a certain extent, right?
Yeah, you mentioned there's evidence that this has worked in Canada. Do you think that those findings will be externally valid so that they will also apply to the United States? Do you think that we would see similar effects if we were to adopt these demonstrably beneficial policies, or might there be differences between the United States and Canada that are relevant here?
Yeah, I think we should definitely talk more about Canada, but I think one thing that I should also say is that it's not either or, right? And it's not just about changing the whole system, right? It's just about some particular policy solutions that we can implement to attract a particular kind of immigrants, for instance, right? So it's not just about changing everything and be like Canada, right? So I don't necessarily think that we should adopt their point-based system, for instance. I don't think it's going to be helpful, both given the current political environment and also the fact that the United States might not necessarily be benefiting from the point system as much as Canada for many different reasons. I would say the general idea that I'm trying to put forward there is that not all immigration is good, right? No matter how much we want to think that, right? And there can be some economic research that shows that maybe in the long term, immigration is beneficial of all possible kinds, right? But it's based on certain assumptions that a lot of voters might not necessarily share or understand, right? The way I put it is that you shouldn't have to have a PhD in economics to understand why immigration is good for you. That's why, unfortunately, it's the case that not all kind of actually beneficial immigration policies, as it might be estimated by economists, are demonstrably beneficial, right? So, but I do think that there is a big overlap, right? There's still a lot of things that we can do in this country and beyond that that is something that people can accept as demonstrably beneficial, meaning that it's straightforwardly and explicitly good for their countries. And I think that's just something that we should always keep in mind when we think about new policies that we can adopt.
So, what are some of those policies, demonstrably beneficial policies, or examples of those kind of policies that you think do have the potential to help people feel more positive toward immigration?
Yeah, so I think increasing admissions of skilled immigrants. It's just one thing that we know from a lot of research that very few people oppose. In fact, I'm not aware of a single major political backlash or a grassroots protest that was against increasing skilled immigration, right? Some people have tried to politicize H-1B visas in the US. It got some traction, but I think it's very, very minor compared to everything else that we hear about immigration politics in general, right? So I think it's just like a slam dunk. Like it's just like I don't think there's any good argument against that. The problem is, of course, is that as everything in politics, you have trade-offs and you always have to bundle various policies, right? So like, can we increase skilled admissions without decreasing any other admissions and things like that, right? But in general, if you have a chance to increase admission of skilled immigrants, I think you should always go for it. No one really like very few people are opposed to that anywhere in the world. But what I'm trying to do with this idea of demonstrably beneficial policy is actually to reframe the idea of selective policies, which I think might be misinterpreted sometimes by pro-immigration advocates as a restrictive policy, right? Because you have to select someone, you have to basically, when you select someone, you have to not select someone else, right? But the idea of demonstrably beneficial policy is actually much broader than that, right? It's not just about admitting the best and the brightest, right? I think it's about admitting employment-based work immigration more generally to fill, let's say, specific labor shortages. It's also about admitting immediate family members and family members of those skilled immigrants, right? So very few people are actually opposed to spousal immigration, right? In fact, even if you talk to the staunchest Trump supporter, Trump himself famously brought immigrants as spouses, right? So very few people are opposed to that. We have very little polling on that just because it's something that is kind of commonsensical, right? But I don't see the reason why, let's say, spousal immigration cannot be easier in this country. Right? Because again, no one is opposed to that. And I think the same thing is true for family-based immigration when it comes to like those skilled workers, right? Oftentimes they have to bring their families, and people are okay with that. A lot of folks would understand that you cannot just uproot yourself and just come to a foreign country and like forget about your family, right? You have to bring those people here too, right? It's also about student immigration. Very rarely it's controversial. It's actually controversial right now in Canada, but I think for reasons related to housing policy, which is a very
Yeah,
different
yeah.
question, right? So in the end, actually, if you think about it, there are a lot of types of immigration that people can understand why it's good, and they would not necessarily be opposed to it. I think the problem is that because it's kind of all lumped together in this kind of one generic label, immigration, policymakers are often they fear backlash, right? They fear backlash. Basically, immigration is so toxic that you don't want to touch it no matter what. But actually, a lot of types of immigration are completely non-controversial. And I think if we can streamline it, increase it, simplify it, I think it's all going to be for the good. And I think last thing I would want to mention here is that I also see some evidence that when a lot of the immigration is like that, there's also more room for humanitarian migration too, right? We see that in Canada, right? So most of their immigration policies are very selective, right? A lot of humanitarian advocates criticize them for that, rightly, right? But if you just look at the raw numbers, they admit more refugees per capita than most other countries, right? So it's not necessarily a trade-off then, right? So you can basically admit a lot of skilled immigrants, but also admit a lot of refugees as well, if basically most people are on board with immigration system as it exists.
So, Alex, I'm interested in this framework of demonstrably beneficial policies. Is it enough to just adopt these policies, or is there some sort of demonstrative, demonstrating and informing people about the benefits that those policies subsequently have that's important in this approach.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not saying that we should disregard communication completely, right? I just think that it should kind of come naturally, right? So I would say that, if something is demonstrably beneficial, it means that you don't necessarily have to frame it in a particular way so that people understand why it's good, right? It's sort of like good by default, as someone would understand regardless of where they're coming from, both politically or in terms of kind of their basic level of education or knowledge, right? So just again, to give you one example, no matter how you might want to frame the economic effects of immigration in Sweden, right? It's just a descriptive fact that an average foreign-born individual, they contribute less in taxes that they consume, right? So the only thing you can do about it is to emphasize something else, that, for instance, that we need diversity or something, right? But it's really hard to win this argument just because, the underlying economic outcomes are just not there, right? So that's what I'm talking about, basically, that you can potentially frame things in a certain way. You can present information or how immigration is affecting your country in a different way, depending on where you're coming from, whether you support immigration or you oppose immigration, right? But in the end of the day, those underlying realities matter, right? People might misperceive them because, not everyone is informed. People have other things to do in their lives. But in the end of the day, it's much easier to demonize immigration in Sweden than it is in Canada, right? And for the reason that objectively they're very, very different.
And just one last question on this. I mean, we've talked a little bit about. I know there's a lot of push in immigrant advocacy world on narrative change and creating new narratives that emphasize sort of individual stories. It seems like from your research, those kind of efforts are having less of an effect than some of what you're talking about, which is a little bit instead of changing the narrative, change the policy to change the narrative. Is that a good way of talking about it?
Yes, absolutely. I think you put it better than I could ever do. But I think obviously, within this kind of whole communication domain, like we can still argue about what is the best way to frame the certain things. I think those things matter on the margin for sure, right? There is some uncomfortable evidence, for instance, that people are much more persuaded by like individual stories than like data and numbers, right? So like I personally would I feel weird about coming up with a pro-immigration argument and just having a story there and a human interest story there. But it seems like it's something that's going to be more persuasive to people than just having some data or whatnot, right? But in the end of the day, again, I think none of those things matter as much as like the underlying policies, right? And so when we say that immigration is good, good given like what policies? Like, do we all the policies that we have right now in the U.S. are demonstrably beneficial? I definitely not, right? Can we change them easily? Definitely not. Again, given the gridlock in Congress, right? But to the extent we can come up with some kind of new visa, new program, I think we should think about the design very carefully, right? So my pitch is that policies should be popular by design, right? So sort of instead of trying to come up with a way to pitch those policies and to frame them to voters, right? We should come up with something that people would understand that it's good, right? So one example that I really like is this idea of labor mobility partnerships that they're putting forward in the Center for Global Development, right? It's the idea where you address real labor shortages in host countries like the United States, right? And you invite people from partners in developing countries, right? And you train people there back at home so that basically every party, both the receiving and the sending countries and immigrants themselves benefit from all these exchanges, right? And it's all kind of explicit, right? No one is cheating anywhere, right? So no one is trying to kind of benefit more than others, right? So it's all kind of legal and legally based and binding, right? So I feel like those things, that's what we need more of, right? So this kind of new policy solutions that are by default, by design, popular potentially.
Okay, well, let's just take a quick break, but when we come back, more from Alex.
And we're back with Alex Kustov talking about how we can make immigration policies more acceptable to the public. So, Alex, we've been talking a lot about the demonstrable benefits and narrative change, but what do you think are the key takeaways for those that do favor expanded legal immigration in the United States? What should they take away from your research?
Yeah, so I think most generally, like again, I show a very simple fact that immigration is only popular in countries where most policies are demonstrably beneficial, right? So it means that where most immigration is work immigration, employment-based immigration, where immigrants are more educated, they're employed, and they contribute more in taxes, right? No matter what you or I may think about immigration justice and our kind of normative predilections, right? It's simply just a fact that there is not a single country that has been able to solve immigration politics without being at least somewhat selective in its admissions. The good news, again, is that what I call demonstrably beneficial policies are much broader than just admitting the best and the brightest, right? In one chapter of my book, actually, I look at what happens to public opinion when governments pass very basic, broad pro-immigration reforms that decrease legal pathways for workers and their families. Again, there's a lot of fear among policymakers that anything pro-immigration is toxic, right? It can lead to populist backlash or whatnot. So I look at this historical data, 24 European countries over the last 40 years, and I find nothing. No evidence of either short-term or long-term backlash to pro-immigration admission policies, right? Again, I cannot say that this holds for all pro-immigration policies ever, right? But when it comes to just increasing legal pathways for immigrants that people can understand why they're good for their countries, nothing happens, right? If anything, it seems like doing those policies can even legitimize immigration in the electorate even further, right? So the countries that have opened up the most over the last 20 or 30 years, actually the countries that saw the biggest shift in positive pro immigration attitudes. Those things, again, very slow changing, right? It might, this change might come not necessarily from individuals changing their minds, but generations changing their minds, right? But in the end of the day, I don't see any downside in just promoting programmatic immigration policies.
And Alex, ideally, we would be shifting the perceptions of the general public, of policymakers, people on of different political leanings. Do we have to take into account different strategies for different types of people?
Yeah, I mean, sure. And I don't think it's just about immigration, right? It's about anything related to persuasion, right? Even if you do marketing, you want to make sure that your audience can relate to what you're saying. Um, but again, we shouldn't overthink it, right? Communication matters so much, only, right? And a lot of the information also is public, right? It makes sense to emphasize different virtues of immigration to different audiences, like, to conservatives as opposed to liberals, right? But you should also make sure that your argument makes sense to everyone in case they see it, right? And I think that's the tricky thing here when it comes to, kind of the informational age and social media, right? Everyone can see anything, right? So that's why I think like we have to just, I don't know, be more practical and pragmatic about it, right? Not necessarily overthink those kind of communication, I don't know, considerations. But, even those things matter at the margin, right? So I'm not saying that we shouldn't care about it all, right? But I think in the end of the day, it's more about policies than, how we talk about it.
So we talked a little bit about this, but looking at the landscape of messaging and advocacy in the United States on immigration right now, do you see much of this in practice, or is this something that's is still maybe needs to be disseminated or acculturated a little more?
I'll be very careful here because I only want to make friends, right? And I also I'm curious how you think about it actually. But I don't see a lot of pro-immigration advocates right now arguing for increasing selective immigration admissions or thinking about the design and kind of popularity of legal immigration admission policies more generally. I think there's a lot of good action happening when it comes to advocating for better immigrant rights for those folks who are already here, for advocating for better and more humane enforcement policies. And again, I don't want to minimize any of those efforts, but I think we also need to figure out how to better do legal immigration admissions that can be popular by design, right? For those folks who do care about it, like yourself, my pitch again is to worry less about messaging and think more about new innovative things we can potentially do given the political constraints, right? So again, this can be something like the labor mobility partnership idea or the welcome core. A lot of those things, again, they not surprisingly come from Canada, where a lot of this innovation is happening.
You asked my opinion, so happy to share. I tend to say something often when I'm asked about this is that I don't think I or anyone else really, if we were pressed on what the mission statement for the United States immigration system is, could tell somebody, right? it wasn't designed with a particular mission statement in mind. It was negotiated. It was, I think, where we are right now is sort of trying to correct and recorrect and maybe overcorrect for past immigration laws that we've had in this country, but we've not sort of started over from scratch since like the 1950s. And so that does sort of mean that the system is kind of, I won't say devoid of purpose, but not, as you said, not demonstrably purposeful for the United States. It's sort of what we negotiated, or what people in Congress were able to negotiate. I'm also quite familiar with the Canadian system, having worked in Canada and dealt with it. In addition to them having sort of created a system that would, they thought, be demonstrably beneficial for Canadians, they also take very heavy efforts to keep it that way. So the government does polling every year amongst Canadians about how they feel about immigration and the immigration system, and they take action based on the results of those polls. So as you mentioned, they just recently decided they were going to restrict foreign student immigration because the public was saying, we think that that's having an adverse impact on housing prices in Canada. Now, they may change their mind later and allow students back in, but at this point in time, to keep the public supportive of immigration overall, they're willing to take that step to reduce student immigration because that's where the public is at. I don't think the United States is going to be able to be that nimble, let's say, with our future policies. But it is interesting to me that, again, frequently, anecdotally, when I'm talking to people about things, there is a sense that immigration can be good for the country. I think people believe that it can be good, but they don't see how it's good for them now.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree with this reading. I think that's very different from Canada, where, especially if you live in a small town and you know that the only doctor has immigrant origin there, you see, you would definitely don't think that, it could have been a native born worker there, right? So, yeah, and I think that's what fascinates me the most about Canada is that, they have a very strong bureaucratic apparatus, right? And they're very, very adaptive, right? They crack down on any kind of illegal immigration very fast. They're criticized for that, but it's all very pragmatic, again, with this goal in mind to keep immigration popular. And it is very, very popular, right? Despite the recent issues that they had, right? Those very high immigration flows that, like, depending on the year, 4 or 5 times larger than in the US, relatively speaking, right? They have full legitimacy among voters, right? There is not a single major political party that challenges this consensus, right? And they're very quick to like adapt and just innovate. And I think we need more of that. We need more of this kind of pragmatism. Again, it's very hard to do it in the US system, right? But I think, as you pointed out, right, I think folks very strongly disagree about the purpose of immigration, right? So if you have a more humanitarian minded mentality, right, you think that we should help others who are less fortunate in the world. And it's very, very commendable, right? But at the same time, we should also realize, especially in the immigration space, that it's very rare for voters thing still, right? And for most folks, they just want immigration to work for them because we live in a democracy, right? Where our representative is supposed to like help us, right? So I think it makes sense that immigration should be a part of it, right? And I think, unfortunately, just kind of doubling down on this kind of humanitarian frame of immigration and policies, I don't think it's just going to work for immigration.
Yeah, Alex, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. You mentioned in Canada they have had this selective policy, skilled worker immigration. You also said that has enabled some of the humanitarian immigration as well. But when it comes to the United States, is the best approach, start with these very selective skilled worker policies, and then that opens the door to the wider humanitarian immigration later on down the line, or do you think these things can be pursued in tandem?
Yeah, I think so. It depends. I think if we could do everything from scratch, I would have done it very differently, right? But we also understand that it's not possible. And I think given that we have a whole history of accepting people from all over the world, I don't think we should dismiss it, right? And I think there is a lot of support for that, maybe not necessarily among like regular voters, but among like people who care more about immigration, right? Again, thinking about how much people care about the issue, willing to volunteer, donate their money, contact their representatives, actually work on it, right? So I think we shouldn't disregard our asylum system or what we have now, but I think in terms of what we do next, I think we should really try to focus on more skill-oriented approaches, more employment-based approach. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be about the best and the brightest, right? It can be just about addressing particular shortages, streamlining the family-based system. That again, it's a very big tradition in the U.S., and I think we should not disregard it, but it can still be made much, much better. I think in general, when again you have a sense among regular voters that immigration is by design good for them, right? In terms of who we accept and why we accept them, right? I think people are more likely to trust their government. And then in terms of, doing things that is not necessarily popular, right? Because again, the whole point of kind of representative democracy, right, is that we don't necessarily have to worry about what our representatives do, right? As long as we believe that everything they do is in our interest, right? Because, they're the experts, they deliberate in the legislature, right? We don't really do that. And so the idea is that if a lot of this immigration is something that people can understand why we need it in the first place, then potentially we can expand other types of immigration too. That, if the crisis hits, right, so obviously we would need to do something, right? When there's like another war or something like that, it's really hard to plan for that. But the idea is that it's only possible to actually help those people in the war and accept them as refugees if people are largely on board with how immigration works. And I think this is pretty much what they have in Canada. To a certain extent. So I really like the idea that, we have this Welcome Core program now, even if it's something that catches on and, becomes more popular. I think that's something that people can understand, right? So even within this domain of humanitarian policy, we can still have more or less demonstrably beneficial things we can do, right? And I think Welcome Core makes sense for most people. I haven't seen much polling done on that, right? But from my perspective, it's hard to argue that it's bad, right? Because people invite those folks themselves, right? So it's better for them. It's their own interest, right, at stake. When it comes to admitting people at the border and processing them, I think I'm much less sure that it can be something that can ever be popular in a democracy like the United States, unfortunately. Again, no matter what I think or the listeners might think, just in terms of our moral convictions, we should, just confront the facts, unfortunately.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about your forthcoming book. What made you decide to write a book about all of this? It just was there was enough there finally to make it worthwhile. And who are you targeting your book towards? Who's the audience you want to read it?
Yeah, so I mean, there's so many books about immigration, and also, at least in academia, also a lot of stuff about public opinion too. What I see happening is that a lot of those books are about white people just like immigrants themselves who are already here, right? About the role of racism and xenophobia, how this all contributes to populist backlash and, the rise of right wingers and all that. I think it's all important. But what I always wanted to know is whether, given all that racism among voters that we have, and it's really hard to change, given all those opportunistic demagogues who demonize immigrants for electoral gains that are always going to be there, whether there is a way to make admitting more new immigrants popular. I couldn't find anything on that, so I had to write a book on it. So it is primarily an academic book with a lot of kind of new empirical data and somewhat technical analysis. But my hope is that at least the few, first chapters and the last chapters are quite popular. It can be a one-stop summary, basically, on everything we know about so far about immigration public opinion and how we can or cannot change it. So my hope is that more practical policy researchers and practitioners like yourself can have it as a one-stop solution to kind of learn all of that.
Sounds great. And when is it due out?
Yeah, so it's in the press now, so hopefully before the end of the year. So it's going to be sometime after the election or early next year. We'll see.
Great. I look forward to it. And is there anything in that book or anything else that you haven't had a chance to mention that you want to raise while you're on the podcast?
Yeah, so I kind of slightly alluded to that already, but so how the book project initially started and was a part of my dissertation research is I wanted to see what motivates people when they form their views on immigration. And what I find is that most people are not motivated by racism of some kind or like their dislike of immigrants themselves. It's, depending on how you count it, probably like 10 to 20% of voters in the United States and beyond. Instead, most people are just motivated by their sense of solidarity with their compatriots. They simply want their democratic representatives to do better policies for their country, including immigration. Some folks do care about foreigners. I think a lot of us in the immigration space do, and their rights, but we should understand that there are very, very few people like that. So it's kind of like what I call them committed humanitarians or cosmopolitans, right? Depending on how you count, it's again only 10 to 15% of people. So in what I did in the book, I did those so-called dictator games where people had a chance to donate money as a part of the survey, and they had a chance to donate to domestic charities or global charities, and it was like matched. So it was like, for instance, International Red Cross or domestic Red Cross. And what I find is that very few people, when they have a choice, donate to International Red Cross, right? So again, very, very few people who care about foreigners that way. I mean, they're much more pro-immigration, of course, but we cannot really base our immigration policy on those folks because, again, they're a very, very tiny minority. So I just wanted to emphasize that.
That's great. It's nice to know that we're not, well, xenophobia and racism isn't as larger an explainer in the views of people. I think that the term that you use in the book is altruistic nationalists. So I like that framing. Well, I think we'll end it there. But yeah, it's been really great having you on the podcast, Alex.
Thanks so much, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find our podcast episodes on the Bipartisan Policy Center YouTube channel. You can find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown, and you can follow me at Jack Malde. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malde. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.